The theme building is one of the single most recognizable pieces of Southern California iconography, and has been for over 60 years. At the heart of Los Angeles International Airport, which is also known as LAX, the theme building's unique shape and elevated nature was designed to give those inside a sweeping 360-degree view of one of the busiest airports in the world. Suspended beneath the two crossed 135-foot tall parabolic arches that form the legs, there is a restaurant called Encounter, and above that, a viewing platform. Or there was. As of March 2022, both the restaurant and the viewing platform are currently closed to the public. The theme building is an incredible symbol of the futurism and optimism which was everywhere in the United States in the 1950s, but now, to many people, those ideals seem a bit dated. Why did this building matter, and what does it mean now? The United States was in the best position to grow after World War II, and was feeling good for it. Besides the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and some skirmishes in Alaska, the United States didn't experience much conflict on its own soil. Its industry remained basically fully intact, unlike other nations which had the ravages of war destroy their factories and city centers. The U.S. considered itself the hero of World War II, and had turned the tide in the conflict. They thought things were great and would only get better. Luxury goods and new technology were more widely available than ever before. The U.S. was fascinated by the new technology available at the time, like the potential of rockets and atomic energy, and what a future with them may look like. Meanwhile, the people of the U.S. couldn't help but be worried by the looming communist threat. While this is going on, Los Angeles needs to build an airport to support the fastest growing urban area on the planet for technology which has just been invented in 1952, commercial jet aircraft. They hired a who's who team of architect firms. Perhaps the most pronounced architectural firm is Pereira and Luckman, because they'd been hired to work on prior iterations of LAX's development. William Pereira was a Jewish American who won an Academy Award for his brief time as a Hollywood art director, and became a professor of architecture at the University of Southern California. This is where he would meet his future business partner, Charles Luckman. Charles Luckman was a first-generation son to a German and Yugoslavian immigrant. Known as an incredible architect and businessman, he was dubbed the Boy Wonder of American business in 1937 by Time magazine. He'd even go on to be appointed to the President's Committee on Civil Rights during the Truman administration in 1946. Pereira and Luckman spent the 1950s designing a variety of buildings and helping shape the LA skyline, and even met with President Eisenhower during the 50s. The creative director on behalf of Pereira and Luckman at this time is a man named Jin D. Wong, a Chinese-born American, World War II veteran, and a former student of Pereira while he was schooling at USC. The other two firms brought in to help with the design were Paul R. Williams and Wilton Beckett and Associates. Paul R. Williams was the oldest and perhaps the most experienced of the men on the team. He was an incredibly successful black man in a time where there were regular institutional and interpersonal barriers against it, and had designed homes for the ultra-famous in Hollywood, like Bill Bojangles Robinson, Lucille Ball, and Frank Sinatra. Finally, Wilton Beckett was a prolific architect and had earned the highest honor of the American Institute of Architects as early as 1952. These five gentlemen and their teams had a vision of the future, and it was an inclusive one. The airport of the future, with the theme building at its heart, would exemplify all that it meant to be a jet-age airport. They were inspired by entertainment like 1952's War of the Worlds, who Pereira's brother was an art director for, and Walt Disney's Tomorrowland. They were also inspired by the U.S. government and its pledge to get the first satellite into space in 1955. 1 month before the joint team would pitch their plans for the new Los Angeles International Airport in 1957, the Soviet Union would beat the United States in launching the first satellite into space. Sputnik 1 was only able to play a consistent beeping radio transmission and maintain its orbit, but the powerful rocket which carried it into space carried looming threats of potential nuclear delivery with it, and reactivated the Pearl Harbor feelings of vulnerability to potential surprise attack. Terrified about the threat of potential nuclear annihilation and of being scientifically inferior to another superpower, the U.S. reacted sharply. NASA was created, and the space race was on. President John F. Kennedy swore in 1962 that the United States would have a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and the American people were very responsive to it.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Some of this optimism is visible in the promotional video made by LAX itself shortly after its completion, joking that when a group of touring children or adults who needed to travel, that LAX would be the perfect place to accommodate them.
That is, unless you want to board a rocket ship for Mars, in which case we'd probably refer you to the closest spaceport.
The thing is, the 1960s were a traumatic decade for the self-image of the United States. Kennedy is assassinated, the Vietnam War becomes significantly worse, and the civil rights movement is basically a war of culture and ideals at home. One thing Americans did have in common during the 1960s was fear of the Soviets, and that fear was a powerful motivator. Even with all this going on, in 1969 the U.S. government was able to land a man on the moon and bring them home. It was the gold medal of the space race, and an incredible unifying moment for all Americans and humanity in general. Perhaps the single greatest achievement of humanity was done as a reaction out of fear and in defiance of communist ideals. The U.S. continued to do lunar missions for 3 years, but when it became clear that the Soviets couldn't afford to follow suit, the race was won. There isn't such a need to pour resources into space exploration when your rival can't compete. The last time a human was on the moon was December 19, 1972, nearly 50 years ago. The U.S. sent many probes and satellites to look out at our celestial neighbors, but the urgency was gone. Instead of manned exploration, the Space Shuttle was announced in 1972 to assist in achieving America's new goal, a space station. The U.S. even went as far as to extend an olive branch in 1975 in the form of a joint American-Soviet operation and cooperation in space. The space race really was over. The following decades were complicated. The theme building remained unchanged while surrounded by an increasingly developed airport. In a few short years, the United States wrestled with the lows of the Challenger explosion and the tragedy of lost lives and resources, and the highs of the collapse of the Soviet Union and winning the Cold War. Then, in December of 1992, 30 years after its construction, the Los Angeles City Council designated the theme building a cultural and historical monument, which offers it protections from demolition and external artistic adjustment. In 1997, the theme building's restaurant, The Theme Room, was completely refurbished into a retro 60s diner called Encounter and was incredibly popular. In 2001, the terror attacks on the World Trade Center forced the American people to acknowledge the reality of anti-American sentiment around the world. Encounter was closed for 8 months, while the theme building was evaluated as a security risk, and the observation deck on the roof remained closed indefinitely. With the birth of the TSA and new security checkpoints in airport terminals, the theme building is significantly more isolated from passengers than it has ever been. In January 2003, tragedy struck again when Space Shuttle Columbia had its own catastrophic failure, further hurting American sentiment toward space travel. In 2006, a half-ton 5-foot by 10-foot piece of stucco fell from one of the arches above Encounter, and the building was closed temporarily for repairs. The extensive repairs and retrofitting cost $12.3 million and went on for 4 long years. Afterwards, the observation deck would reopen to the public, but only during limited hours. The 3 surviving space shuttles retired after their final missions in 2011, and the U.S. spent 2012 to 2020 relying on private contractors like SpaceX and Orbital Sciences, and other nations like Russia to build its rockets and to fly missions for it. In 2013, Encounter would close, leaving the theme building empty most of the time, and by 2018, the observation deck above it would be permanently closed to the public as well. The Space Force was developed in 2019 as a means to protect American assets and sovereignty in space. It's an important development in the modern era, as our technology of the future is so dependent on satellites in space to function properly. It was the first new branch of the armed forces since the birth of the Air Force in 1947. As things continue to grow around LAX, the theme building at its heart becomes less visible from the ground, like Mesoamerican pyramids being covered by the urban jungle. While the future of the theme building is uncertain, the ideals it was inspired by have lived on in the hearts and minds of a very passionate few. In 2020, NASA announced the Artemis missions. As a sister program to the Apollo missions of the 60s and 70s, NASA plans on returning to the moon after 50 years to land the first woman and first person of color on the moon. They plan to establish the first long-term presence above and on the moon, and then eventually send the first astronauts to Mars. Then, on December 25, 2021, NASA launched the James Webb Telescope, the most powerful telescope ever launched into space. It recently gave humanity its first image while calibrating, and even this test is staggering. Will the new, impressive James Webb Telescope invigorate American passions for space exploration? Could American competition in space with China or Russia be a good thing? Conflict inspires competition like nothing else, and could be a way to diffuse political tension and prevent other more hostile types of conflict. The future is uncertain, but the possibilities for new discovery are hard to ignore. For a while, the past's idea of the future seemed so distant and unreasonable. Perhaps we can see these triumphs and learn to hope again.